Hello, everybody. Welcome to Miss Peggy's Story Time. We're not reading the Chronicles of Narnia anymore because we finished those, but now we're going to start on another book, maybe even more famous than the Chronicles of Narnia are. This one is called Pilgrim's Progress, and it was written 350 years ago. So sometimes the language is a little old-fashioned, but I've got a more modern translation of it, although some of the things are still, you can't translate old things and old terms into modern English. So I'll just try to help you out as I go along if I know the answer. Anyway, this book was written by a man named John Bunyan, and he was put into prison, if you can imagine, for preaching the gospel back in England in 1676. And while he was in prison, he wrote this book, partly because he had a burden for his people in his church who now didn't have a pastor anymore, and because he loved the Bible and he had a lot of experience about the trouble that you can go through as a Christian in this world, and he wanted to share it. So he wrote this story that illustrates the Christian life from beginning to end, and he did it in the form of an allegory, which is sort of like a parable, you might say, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And so let's dive right in and see how we get along. Now, the book I have here does not have any pictures in it, but I have another book that does have pictures in it. So it may be a little awkward, but I'm going to do my best to put one book down, pick up the other one, and show you pictures if you're interested in seeing pictures. I always like pictures, so we're going to do what we can. All right. So chapter 1 of Pilgrim's Progress. And the person who is speaking is John Bunyan, and he's telling us that as I walked through the wilderness of this world, I came to a place where there was a clearing, and I laid down in it to sleep. And while I slept, I dreamed about a man in ragged clothes who stood with his face turned away from his own house and with a book in his hand, carrying a huge burden on his back. I saw him reading from the pages of the book, weeping and shaking in fear, until eventually he cried out loudly, "What shall I do?" He anxiously returned home and tried to remain calm so that his wife and children wouldn't be worried about him, but he became so distressed that he could no longer be silent, and he decided that it was time to tell his family exactly what was on his mind. And here is a picture from this other book of our pilgrim who's sitting at his house, and you can see it's an old-fashioned house from like 350 years ago, and there's the huge burden on his back, and his wife and his 4 sons. All right. "I love you all dearly," he said to his wife and children, "but I feel that I must share with you this miserable and heavy burden that I've been carrying. You see, I've been reading in this book, and I learned that our town will be destroyed, burned with fire from heaven, and unless we find a way of escape, we are all going to die." His family and friends were all amazed to hear this story, not because they believed him, but because they thought that he was losing his mind. So as evening approached, they were confident that a good night's sleep was all he needed to settle down, and so they quickly got him to bed. Here's a picture of the sweet wife tucking her husband into bed. When morning came, they asked him how he was feeling, and he said, "It's worse than before." He wanted to share with them more about what he had learned in the book, but they would not listen. He wanted to share with them, but sometimes they spoke harshly to him, and at other times they just laughed at him, and eventually they just ignored him. He was sad, so he went back to his room and prayed for them while feeling very sad and sorrowful himself. For weeks, he would go out alone into the woods and the fields to read and to pray. One day, as he was walking out in the field, he became so distressed that he cried out, "Who will save me?" He thought that perhaps he should run, but where should he run to? As he stood there in misery, not knowing what to do, a man named Evangelist walked up to him and asked calmly, "Why are you crying?" Oops, back to the other book. Here's a picture of our man with his burden on his back, and way off in the distance, maybe you can see a man named Evangelist is coming to meet him. Do you know what an evangelist is? He's a a preacher, someone who comes to tell you the story about the Lord Jesus. So the evangelist came and said to him, why are you so sad? And he said, Sir, I've been reading in this book, and I now realize that I am condemned to die. And after that, God will judge me. And I find that I'm not willing to die, and I'm afraid to do the second. I really am afraid to die. An evangelist responded, why do you fear dying, since this life is so full of evil? And the man answered, because I fear that this burden on my back is too heavy, and it'll make me sink down lower than the grave. I will fall into hell. If I'm not fit to die, then I'm sure I'm not fit to go into judgment, and from there to execution. Oh, when I think of these things, it makes me cry. Well, if that's your condition, said the evangelist, why are you standing here? The man shrugged his shoulders and he said, because I don't know where to go. Evangelist handed him a scroll with these words on it, flee from the wrath to come. Those are words from the book of Matthew, by the way. And the man read it and he said, but where should I flee to? There was a wide field before them with a little gate in it. Do you see that wicket gate? Said the evangelist. A wicket gate is, sometimes it's a small gate in a wall, a stone wall or a wooden wall. It's a little gate for people to go through. But more often, a wicket gate is a little gate inside a great big wooden door, so that you don't have to open the whole big door to go in and out. You can just open the little one if you're just walking. If you needed to bring out your big carriage or your big hay wagon or whatever, then you'd want to open both doors. But for just one person going in and out, they just open up the little wicket gate that's in the middle of it. So evangelist said to him, do you see that wicket gate? And the man looked far into the distance and he said, no, I don't. And evangelist said, how about the light? Do you see the light? And the man looked closer and he says, yes, I think I do. Good, he said. Keep your eye on that light and go straight to it. When you arrive at the gate, knock, and you will be told what you need to do. Then in my dream, I saw that Christian, for that was the man's name, set off running to the gate. Now, Christian had not gone far from his own home when his wife and children came running out, begging with him and pleading with him to come back home. But putting his hands to his ears, he ran on and cried, life, eternal life! And he never looked behind him, but ran on toward the middle of the field. Here's his family leaning over the gate, calling for him to come back. And there's two men that we're going to hear about in just a minute, chasing him, trying to persuade him to come back. But he didn't want to go back to the city of destruction. He didn't want to die in the fire. He wanted to find eternal life. His neighbors also came out to see him run. And as he ran, some mocked him, others threatened him, and some cried after him to return. Two of his neighbors, they're the two that we saw in that picture, two of his neighbors, obstinate and pliable, they were called, set off to bring him back, by force if necessary. By this time, Christian was a good distance ahead of them, but they were determined to catch him, and eventually they did. Christian turned to the men and he said, why have you come after me? They had to stop and catch their breath from running so hard, and they said, we have come to persuade you to come back with us. And here's a picture of the two men, obstinate and pliable. Obstinate means that you're really set in your ways and you don't ever want to change your mind. Even if somebody tells you that what you're doing is wrong, you don't care. I know what I am a dwarf and the dwarfs are for the dwarfs. That kind of people, who won't change their mind no matter what the evidence is. And pliable, usually it means something that's easy to bend, easy to fold. Think of a piece of aluminum foil. You can fold it, you can bend it, you can twist it, you can wad it up into a ball. That's being pliable. You believe everything. You're just ready to go with anything that comes along without stopping to think whether it could be right or wrong. Okay, enough of that. We have come to persuade you to return with us. But Christian stood his ground. I can no longer live in the city of destruction. I was born and raised there, but now I know what kind of city it is. My eyes have been opened, and I know the truth. Why don't you both come with me? Otherwise, you are going to die in that city and sink down below the grave into a place that burns with fire." "What?" said Obstinate, astonished, "and leave our families and the comforts of life to follow you?" "Yes," said Christian. "Everything that you leave behind will not even compare to the smallest portion of what I'm seeking. And if you come with me and persevere, you'll find more than enough. I'm telling you the truth. Come with me and see." Obstinate was curious and said, "What are the things that you're searching for that can't be found in this world?" "I'm searching for a joy that can never fade," said Christian, "a secure inheritance in heaven that cannot be corrupted and will be given to me at the appointed time and those who search for it." And he held out the book in his hand. "Don't take my word for it. Read it in my book." Obstinate threw up his hands and quickly dismissed Christian. "What nonsense," he said. "Put away your foolish book. Are you coming back with us or not?" Christian shook his head. "No, I will not. I've put my hand to the plow and I will not turn back." Obstinate motioned to Pliable. "Let's go home without him, Pliable. There's no convincing a fool once they believe themselves wiser than all their family and friends." But Pliable did not move. He seemed to be considering Christian's offer. "Let's not be too quick to judge Christian," said Pliable. "If he's telling the truth, then what he's searching for is far more valuable than anything we have here. I'm inclined to go with Christian." Obstinate was dumbfounded. "What? You can't be serious. Don't follow a fool like him. Come back with me." "Don't listen to him," said Christian to Pliable. "Come with me and you'll discover the things I spoke of and so much more too." He extended the book to Pliable. "Read the truth for yourself in this book that has been fully confirmed by the blood of him who wrote it." What do you think this book is, by the way? The Bible. Who is this person who's shed blood to write it? The Lord Jesus, right? Pliable looked at his friend Obstinate and said, "I think that I will go along with Christian and share my fate with his." And then he turned to Christian and said, "Do you know the way to this glorious place?" "Well, I've been told by a man named Evangelist to hurry to that little gate in front of us where we will receive further instructions, and we'll be told how to find the way." Pliable was enthusiastic. "What are we waiting for? Let's get going." So while the two of them took off together as fast as they could for the gate, Obstinate stood in disbelief and yelled after them, "I'm going back home, and I refuse to be misled by you fools." So here's a picture of Pliable and Christian, and they've left Obstinate behind, and they're setting out to go across that wide, wide field to get to the little wicket gate. Turn the page so I'm ready for the next one. Okay. In my dream, I saw Obstinate go back to his home while Christian and Pliable set off to cross the field, talking as they went. "Pliable, I'm so happy that you decided to come with me," said Christian. "If Obstinate could only understand the dangers and the terrors that are waiting for him, he would not have turned his back so quickly." "I'm sure that's true. Now, Christian," pressed an eager Pliable, "since it's just the two of us, tell me more about all the things we're going to find on this search." Christian once again reached for his book. "I can understand it in my head," he said, "but for some reason I find it difficult to talk about. However, I can find the answers to all your questions in this book." "And you're confident that the words in this book are true?" said Pliable, pointing to the Christian's book. "Absolutely," said Christian, "without hesitation. This book was made by him who cannot lie." "Well, that's good enough for me. So tell me more about these things in your book." So Christian eagerly began. "The book tells us of a world with no boundaries and a life that never ends." "Amazing! What else does it say?" "It says that we shall receive a crown of glory and robes that will make us shine like the sun." "That's incredible. Does it say anything else?" Oh, yes, that we will never grieve again, and that the king of that place will wipe away every tear from our eyes. Wonderful, said Pliable. And then he paused and grew concerned. But who will we meet there, and what will they be like? We will be met by angels and 10,000s of all the saints in robes, so bright that our eyes will dazzle just to look at them. There will be those that have gone before us in this world and who have stood for the faith and suffered greatly, including being burned on the stake, thrown to wild beasts, and drowned in the sea, all because of their love for the Lord. They will not harm us, but they will greet us with love because they walk with God. Although fascinating, it did not seem to alleviate Pliable's concerns. That's all very interesting, he said, but what will be our share in all of this, and what will it cost? The Lord of that land has promised that if we are truly willing to receive our inheritance, he will give it to us freely, said Christian. Pliable let out a sigh of relief. That's very good news, Christian. Come on, let's hurry and get there quicker. I'm trying, said Christian, moving as fast as he could, but this load on my back slows me down. As they were walking, Christian and Pliable drew near to a very muddy swamp named Despair. In the Old English, the word was despond, the slough of despond, or the swamp of despair. Despond or despair both means you kind of lost all hope. They came to a very muddy swamp named Despair in the middle of the field. Since neither of them were paying any attention to where they were going, they both fell in. They battled in the swamp for some time, totally covered in mud, and the load that Christian carried on his back made him sink even more. All right, here's a picture of the two of them in the swamp. Can you see? They're up to their ears in mud. Not looking very happy about it either, are they? Looking around, Pliable said, Christian, where are we now? Truthfully, I have no idea, Christian said, struggling to find a way out. Offended, Pliable angrily asked, Is this the happiness you've been talking to me about all this time? Is this what happens at the beginning of our journey? If that is so, I cannot imagine what we're going to find by the time we get to the end. If I get out of this mess alive, I'm going home, and you can travel to your noble country without me. And with that, he gave a desperate struggle or two and climbed out of the swamp on the side nearest to his home, and Christian never saw him again. There are some people who say that they want to be Christians and they want to go to heaven, but the first little bit of trouble that comes upon them, if this is what the Christian life is like, you can count me out, I'm going back. And they do, and that's regrettably what happens. We don't want to be like that. We want to be like Christian. Let's find out what happens next. So Christian was left to battle his way through the swamp of despair on his own without any help. He formulated a plan and decided that his best option was to reach the side of the swamp that was nearest to the wicket gate, in the opposite direction from his home. He slowly inched his way across the muddy swamp until he finally reached the edge. But then he found he couldn't get out because of the heavy burden on his back. In this picture right here, we've got two things going on, really. We've got Christian over here with his big burden on his back, but right here we've got Pliable, who's clutching at a root of a tree there, or a branch of a tree, to pull himself out, and he's going to go home. But you'll notice that there's a man standing right here. We'll talk about him now. So he inched his way across the muddy swamp until he finally reached the edge, but then he found that he couldn't get out because of the heavy burden on his back. Then I saw in my dream a man whose name was Help, who came to him and said, What are you doing there? A man called Evangelist gave me directions to the wicket gate so that I could escape the destruction that's coming to my city, and as I headed to the gate, I fell in here. Well, why didn't you look for the stepping stones that crossed the swamp? Help asked him. I'm afraid that I was in such a hurry that I didn't see them, and I just fell right in, Christian admitted, feeling a little embarrassed. Help reached out to Christian. Give me your hand and I will pull you out. And with that, Help pulled Christian out of the swamp, set him on solid ground, and wished him well. Then in my dream, I approached Help and asked him, "Excuse me, sir, since this place is on the way from the city of destruction to the wicket gate, why has no one repaired this patch of ground to keep those who come from falling into the swamp?" And he said to me, "This swamp can't be fixed. Since it is a low-lying plot of land, all sorts of scum and filth associated with the conviction of sin just drain into it. Therefore, it's called the Swamp of Despair, or Slough of Despond, if you want to use the old-fashioned term for it. As a traveling sinner becomes aware of their own lost condition, doubts and fears come into their minds, and then it all drains down and settles into this place, and that's what makes this ground so bad. The king never intended that this place should remain in such a bad condition. For this reason, his workers have been attempting to repair this ground, according to his directions, for over 2,000 years. To the best of my knowledge, this swamp has swallowed up at least 20,000 cartloads, which equals to millions of wholesome instructions that have been brought from all the regions of the king's dominion in all seasons. It has been said that these were the best possible materials to make solid ground. Good sermons is what he's talking about. Good Bible studies, all the kind of things that would keep us from getting despair and despondent. And sometimes people just don't pay any attention to them. And so, even so, the swamp of despair remains after all they did. The lawgiver has provided a number of reliable and solid steps placed in the middle of the swamp, but it's hard to see them sometimes for all the filth. And when the weather changes, the steps are hardly visible. And even when men do notice the steps, they often miss them on account of guilt-induced dizziness. But the ground is good where they enter the gate. Now, in my dream, Pliable had gone back home. And some of his friends called him wise for going back home, while others said that he was a fool to have gone in the first place, and others just mocked him and called him a coward for giving up too easily when encountering a few difficulties. Pliable did his best to stay away from them, and that was when he noticed that they had all turned their taunts and laughter to poor Christian. However, that's enough about Pliable. And now we have another little subsection called the Advice of Worldly Wise Man. Alone again, Christian continued his journey, walking through the field until he spotted a man coming to meet him. The man introduced himself as Mr. Worldly Wise Man from the large town of Carnal Policy, not too far from Christian's own home. And here we have a picture of Mr. Worldly Wise Man here. Does he look like somebody we would trust? No, he does not, does he? Nope, we're going to find out about him in just a second. I've got two books going on here, so just give me a little break here. Okay, whoops. As he came toward Mr. Worldly Wise Man noticed that he was groaning, and he said to him, "Would you like to get rid of your burden?" "Oh, great honorable man, sorry, I've missed a little bit here. Let me go back and see what yes, I'm sorry, I skipped a whole page, forgive me. That's the trouble with trying to read two books at a time. It's hard to do. He saw him struggling and said, "Say there, friend, where are you going with that heavy burden on your back?" "Yes, it is a heavy burden, probably greater than anyone has had to carry," said Christian. "If you must know, I'm heading to the wicket gate over there. And that's because I've been told that I can get it removed over there." "Do you have a wife and children?" the man asked you. Sadly, Christian said, "Yes, I do, but since I've been carrying this heavy burden, I no longer find pleasure in them as I once did. In fact, sometimes I feel like I don't have any family at all. I would like to give you some good advice if you'll listen to me," said Mr. Worldly Wise Man. "If it's good advice, I will listen to it. Quite honestly, I need some," said Christian. "Then I would tell you to get rid of that burden on your back as quickly as you possibly can. You'll never be able to rest and experience the blessing that God has in store for you unless you do." Well, that's exactly what I'm trying to do, said Christian. But I can't get rid of it by myself, and I found that no one else has been able to help me with it either. That's why I'm heading to the gate, as I told you before, so I can get rid of it. Worldly Wise Man raised his eyebrows. Who told you that going to that gate would get rid of your burden? Oh, a very great and honorable man, as I recall. His name was Evangelist. Worldly Wise Man grimaced. That man? He's a terrible guide, and he's given you the most dangerous advice possible. It should be obvious to you. Just look at the mud from the swamp of despair all over your clothes. Trust me, that swamp is just the beginning of your troubles. I'm older and more experienced, and I guarantee that if you continue on this path, you'll meet with pain, sadness, hunger, nakedness, lions, dragons, darkness, and the sword too. In a word, death. I advise you not to listen to this man evangelist. Well, I appreciate your advice, but I don't think you quite understand, said Christian. This burden on my back is worse than all those things you just mentioned. Right now, I really don't care who or what I meet along the way as long as I can get rid of it. Pointing to Christian's back, Worldly Wise Man asked, How did you get your burden in the first place? Christian lifted up his book. I found it by reading this book. I thought so, said Worldly Wise Man. I've seen just this sort of thing before in other weak men, just like you. They begin to learn about teachings too difficult for them to understand, and in no time they are confused, and eventually they begin to suffer and humiliate themselves by searching for desperate measures to cure themselves without a clue as to what will happen. All right. Here's a picture of Mr. Worldly Wise Man giving our poor friend Christian advice to just ignore what, let me back it up a little bit so you can see the whole page. So to tell him to just ignore what Evangelist told him, that it's a whole bunch of nonsense. That might be true for some, said Christian, but I know exactly what I'm looking for. Relief from this burden is what it is. Excuse me if I just, this is crazy, isn't it? I got 2 books and the computer and, okay, let's try that page again now. But why are you seeking relief like this when it's so dangerous? If you will be patient and listen to me, I will tell you exactly how to find what you're looking for, and risk-free at that. In fact, my way is not only closer, but it's also less dangerous, and you'll find safety and friendship and happiness. Christian was open to hearing more, and he begged, Please, sir, tell me your secret. Absolutely. And pointing off in a different direction from the gate, he said, Why, just a short distance away from here is the village of Morality. When you get there, ask for a gentleman named Legality. Now, he has an excellent judgment and a great reputation and is renowned for helping people loose their burdens. And not only that, he is also skilled in curing the anxieties that accompany those burdens. If I were you, I would go straight to him right now. You'll find his house is a little less than a mile from here. And if he's not home, ask for his son, Civility. He's also quite pleasant and will also be able to help you, just like his father can. I assure you that your burden will be removed in no time. Worldly Wise Man continued. Afterwards, if you still choose not to go home, you can send for your wife and children to come and live with you in the village. You'll find many wonderful homes that are empty and available, but reasonably priced. In fact, the overall standard of living is very cheap. It's the perfect environment to raise a family. You have honest neighbors and financially secure and attractive future. Now, Christian was not sure what to do, but after thinking it over for a few minutes, he decided that he would trust the words of Mr. Worldly Wise Man. So, Christian said, eager to get started, how do I get to this man's house? Do you see that hill? Said Worldly Wise Man, pointing off in the distance. Yes, I do. I'll go directly to that hill, and the first house you come to is his. So Christian left the path to the wicket gate and set out on a new path to find Mr. Legality and finally get his burden removed. Christian left the narrow way and ventured out to find Mr. Legality to find help with his burden, but the closer he got to the hill, which seemed more like a mountain, the harder it was to go up. In fact, the hill rose so high that it seemed to hang over him. He became paralyzed with fear, and he didn't know what to do. And his burden seemed to weigh heavier on him than ever. And suddenly the flames of fire burst out from the side of the mountain, and Christian began to sweat and became deathly afraid of being burned. Here's a picture of the mountain. Look at that. There's poor Christian down at the bottom. Do you see where my finger is there? It's a huge mountain, and it does look like it's going to collapse on his head any minute, doesn't it? Why did I ever listen to worldly wise man? Said Christian. Just then he spotted Evangelist coming along the road. He was relieved, but at the same time he was a bit embarrassed since he had ignored his advice. As Evangelist grew closer, Christian could tell that he was disappointed. What are you doing here? Said Evangelist. Christian didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Aren't you Christian, the man that I found crying outside the city of destruction? And here's a picture of Evangelist talking to Christian, who's looking pretty embarrassed. Yes, Christian said, not daring to look up. Yes, I am he. I'm sorry, said the Evangelist. Did I not point you to the way that leads to the wicket gate? Yes, you did. Then I'm confused. How have you ended up so far away from the way? How did you end up here? After I got out of the swamp of despair, I met a gentleman who told me about another man in the village of morality who could remove my burden, said Christian, glancing up at Evangelist. Who was he, and what did he look like? Well, he looked like a gentleman, said Christian. At first, I wanted to stay on the way to the gate, but he was very persuasive, and he finally convinced me that his way was best. But when I got to this mountain, however, and I saw how steep it was, I froze because it looked like it might fall on me at any moment. Evangelist inquired of Christian further. Tell me exactly what this gentleman said to you. He asked me where I was going, and I told him. And then what did he say? He asked if I had a family, and I told him, yes, that I hadn't been able to enjoy them as before, since I've been carrying this burden around on my back. Evangelist continued to probe. Tell me more. He suggested I should get rid of my burden as quickly as possible. And then Christian finally looked up and said, I told him that was exactly what I was trying to do, and that's why I was going to the wicket gate, to get relief. But he claimed that he knew a better way, one that was shorter and less difficult, and he said that he would take me to the man who was skilled at removing burdens. And Christian looked down again. So I believed him, and I turned away from your way to his, hoping it would be better. But when I got here, I realized that things were not as he had promised, and I stopped because I felt like I was in danger, and now I don't know what to do. I want you to calm down for a minute and listen to me, said Evangelist, so that I can show you the word of God. Christian stood shaking in expectation of what Evangelist might say. Evangelist began reading from the book. See that you do not refuse the godly advice, just like the nation of Israel did. For if God's own people did not escape judgment and suffered for it, how much more will you suffer if you turn away from him who warns you from heaven? And what's more, he tells us that if we are his, we will live by faith. But if we turn our backs on him, our souls will suffer without him. Christian, you are the man who is running into this suffering, Evangelist said, pointing at him. You have rejected God's counsel by going in a different direction from the way of peace, and you're almost at the point of losing eternal life. Christian's face fell and he began to cry aloud. What have I done? What have I done? I'm ruined. But Evangelist caught him by the right hand and said, Men may be forgiven for their sins and indiscretions. Don't be like someone who has no faith. You need to start believing. This gave Christian some hope, and he stood back up, shaking. Evangelist continued. Now, please pay attention to what I'm going to tell you. And I'm going to tell you about this man who has fooled you, Mr. Worldly Wise Man. He delights in worldly thinking so much that he believes that it will save him from having to trust in the cross of Christ. Why do you think he attends the Church of Morality? It's because of his worldly attitude that he tries to oppose me and the work of God. He's the kind of man who believes that you can get to heaven by just doing good works and being a nice person, that you don't have to believe in Jesus or trust him or give your life to him. You just work your way to heaven by doing good works. I believed that way too. When I was younger, I went to a church that taught this, that if you did enough good works, your balance sheet would look good. You'd have more good things on one side of the column and then bad things on the other. And if your passing rate was more than 50%, then you'd get into heaven. Oh, boys and girls, don't fall into that slough of despond, that swamp of despair. That's horrible. That is not true. Jesus is the only way. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me, he says. But I'm getting off the track here. There are three things in this man's advice that you must absolutely hate. First, his cunning ability to turn you away from the true path. Secondly, his work in displaying the cross is unpleasant and repulsive. And finally, he points you in a direction that will ultimately lead to death. And feeling like Christian needed some more explanation, he continued, let's talk more about each one of these things. As I said, first, you must be cautious of his ability to turn you away from the true path, even though you did consent for a time. Why would you listen to the advice of Mr. Worldly Wise Man instead of the voice of God? The Lord tells us to go through the straight gate, the gate to which I sent you, because that gate leads to life. Unfortunately, few find it, because this wicked man turns you and others away from it, and instead it led you almost to destruction. You should be disappointed in yourself for ever listening to him. Secondly, he will try to convince you that the cross is detestable, but you should prefer it more than all the treasures in the world. Besides, the King of Glory has said that if you wish to save your life, you must be willing to lose it. And if you follow him, but you don't, in comparison, hate your father, mother, wife, children, brothers, and sisters, and even your own life, in comparison to your love for him, you cannot be his disciple. Think about it like this. Mr. Worldly Wise Man wants you to believe that God's way will lead to suffering and death. But the truth is, you can't have eternal life without following God's way. Therefore, you must strongly reject Mr. Worldly Wise Man's advice. And finally, you must hate the fact that the directions he gave you lead to death. Let's talk more about this man, Legality, who supposedly would have helped you to remove your burden. This man is actually the son of a slave woman who is in bondage along with her children. An evangelist pointed to the hill that had overpowered Christian. You see, this bondwoman represents Mount Sinai, which is the mountain you feared would fall on your head. Now, if she and all her children are in bondage, how do you expect that she is going to be able to help you? You thought Legality could provide an easier route to get you what you wanted, but he has never helped anyone get rid of his burden, nor will he, regardless of what Mr. Worldly Wise Man tells you. Evangelist placed his hand on Christian's shoulder. The fact is, no man is able to get rid of his own burden, and he never will be, and he can't expect that obeying the moral law will do it for him either. Mr. Worldly Wise Man is a liar, Mr. Legality is a cheat, and as for his son Civility, he's a hypocrite and no better. Believe me, there is nothing substantial in anything that these men say. Their only aim is to cheat you of your salvation and turn you from following the true way that I have told you about. After this, Evangelist called alive to the heavens for confirmation of what he had just said, and immediately words and fire came out of the mountain over where Christian was standing, which made every hair on his body stand on end. Then he heard the following words: "Those who rely on the works of the law are under the curse, for it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who does not continue to obey every law written in the book of the law.'" Christian now expected death, so he began to cry out and curse the moment he ever met Mr. Worldly Wise Man, calling himself 1,000 fools for even listening to his lies. He was ashamed that he had ever been led so easily by bad advice coming from human reasoning, and that he could turn his back so easily on the right way. Christian lifted up his head in tears. "Is there any hope for me, Evangelist? Would it be possible for me to get back onto the right way and continue on to the wicket gate? Or am I now stuck forever in my disobedience? I'm so sorry that I ever listened to that man's lies. Can my sin ever be forgiven?" And drawing him near, Evangelist looked him directly in the eyes and said, "Your sin is very great because you have committed two evils. You abandoned the right way and you chose to follow a forbidden path. Yet the man at the wicket gate will receive you because he has goodwill for men. However, make sure that you do not turn away from the wicket gate again, or it could likely be your death, as God's anger might burn against you." Then Christian decided to return to the narrow way, and Evangelist kissed him and encouraged him with a smile and said, "God be with you, Christian." And that's the end of chapter 1. And these chapters are a little longer, so I'm only going to be reading one chapter at a time. I hope you've enjoyed that. I sure have been blessed by reading it. And I want all of us to be on the path to the wicket gate and then on the straight way that leads to heaven. That's what I want for you, and that's certainly what I want for myself. And we'll read all about it as we discuss Pilgrim's Progress. So I'll look forward to seeing you next time, and we'll read chapter 2. So bye for now, everybody.